Chapter 12 of
A Waterbiography
by Robert C. Leslie. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Chapter 12. I take part in a naval review. A night in a railway station. The pride of the morning. Sou'westers, oilskins, and summer toilets. A crowded landing place. HMS Achilles boat stops the way. I get on board an ironclad dry. Captain Vansittart and his ship. A sail in a man-o'-war's cutter. To Spithead and back. A long row. I leave Woolstone. Reason for doing so. Go to Deal. The dinghy makes her first appearance on that beach. I add to her freeboard and cruise in her in the Downs, etc. Deal boatmen and their gear. The lugger Tiger. A lugger split in two. Ship on fire in the Downs. A heavy gale. Wind force. Deal boatman's cuddy. Our neighbours at Deal. J.W.M. Turner at Margate. The Van Kook lifeboat. Sandown Castle, etc. We leave Deal. Take a villa at Erith. Why? Economy and advantages of moving. The dinghy sails for Erith with our cat on board. Boating at Erith. Great increase of steam traffic. John Brett on the river. Lower Thames compared with Upper. The last of the flood round Crayfordness. Peter boats, etc. Pick up a capsized canoeist. An old waterman's prophecy verified. I return to Southampton. Sell my old dinghy. A short history of her. Her untimely end at Chelsea. My second son had not long joined his first ship, the Achilles, when, as the papa of a real live midshipman, I got an invitation to see the review of the fleet in honour of the Sultan on July 17, 1867. And to be in time for the boat from the Achilles in the morning, I had to take the last train from Southampton the night before, which arrived at Portsmouth soon after midnight, where, in company with many others, I spent an hour or two before daybreak in the railway station, after which, refreshed by a cup of coffee, I strolled down to Southsea Beach. It was a dirty, fresh, blowing morning, and soon after 6 a.m., seeing a boat leave the Achilles, I walked back through Point Gate to a sally port, where I found, even at that early hour, a crowd of elaborately dressed ladies and gentlemen, all waiting for boats from the respective ships named in their cards of invitation. There was a small something, the pride of the morning we called it, falling with a wide stretch of grey and white broken water between this place of embarkation and the two extended lines of men-of-war at Spithead. And as one after another the ship's boats dashed in, The wet, shiny oilskins of their crews contrasted curiously with the summer toilets of the assembled sisters, cousins, and aunts. The water in front of the quay was now a mere jumble of heavy, rolling steam launches, ship's cutters, and smart gigs, reminding one of a crowded street blocked with gentlemen's carriages near one of the great London theatres of the opera. Only in place of the names or titles of the owners of carriages, it was the name of the man-of-war to which each boat belonged that was called out by the party waiting for her. It was almost a dead noser out to the fleet, and as the steam launches started with 2 or 3 boatloads of guests in tow, it was something like a case of "Come under my plaidie," as officers gave up their oilskins to the more unprotected among the ladies. It was a work of time before a party for any particular ship got fairly off, there being almost as much of a scramble among the boats as that attending the embarkation of passengers in an Italian steamer by the boatmen inside the mole at Naples. Boats whose party had not arrived stopping the gangway, and those wanted being the outside ones, which led to much chaff among the different officers in charge, especially if one of them was at all slow in shipping his party. "Now, sir, when you are ready, we are. Or perhaps you'd kindly drop astern if you're not in a hurry, and make room for those who are. There's plenty of time for you," etc. The launch from the Achilles was one of the last to arrive, and had to wait some time before she could get alongside the quay. I was lucky enough to find a corner in her forward, under a tarpaulin tilt, and got on board the ship dry. But from the way the spray flew over her afterpart and the 2 boats in tow, many new bonnets and hats, in spite of a cloud of umbrellas, must have been ruined in the short trip out to Spithead. Once on board the great ironclad and inside the shelter of her high bulwarks, one hardly knew, except for the hum of it among the lofty spars and rigging, that it was blowing a double-reefed topsail breeze. Admiral Vansittart, then in command of the Achilles, was a most kindly host to all on board his ship that day, and I spent a pleasant quarter of an hour in his pretty cabin hung with flowers and bird cages, while a pair of white cockatoos roamed at large about it. Lunch for the friends of sub-lieutenants and middies was served in their large, airy gun-room, and though no daylight ever penetrated the apartment below where my boy slung his hammock and kept his chest, I came to the conclusion that in such a ship, commanded by a man who took as much interest in the youngsters as Captain Vansittart did, there might be harder times at sea than those of a middy on board HMS Achilles. The fleet was anchored in 2 long lines, the northern one formed of ironclads, which in those days were mostly full-rigged sea-going ships, and the southern of the old wooden auxiliary screw line-of-battle ships. By the Queen's desire, none of the ships moved that day, so that the review was merely a procession of the Royal Yacht, the Admiralty Yacht, and others, up and down between the men of war. The wind blew hard all day, and in order to make sure of an early train for Southampton, I took advantage of one of the ship's cutters starting for shore, and with 2 other visitors dropped into her and made my first and last trip under sail in a man-o'-war's boat. It was while this fleet, with that valuable middy in it, lay here that I boarded the Achilles in my own boat one Saturday to get leave for him until Monday. I had a long beat against a southeast wind to Spithead, which after leaving the Achilles in the afternoon died away, and with a foul tide we barely held our own for 2 hours, so that I had to row the boat nearly 20 miles in a calm before reaching the Itchen about 8:30 that evening. I have been spoken of by friends as unstable as water, but it was the then doubtful character of the water supply and other insanitary matters which led to my leaving Woolstone. And after a week or 2 spent in looking round, we pitched upon a large, low-rented house upon the north end of Deal Beach, to which we moved our furniture and the dinghy by rail. There was nothing but a roadway and a narrow strip of shingle between this house and the Downs. Indeed, so sea-beaten was this bit of beach that it was only in finest weather that I dare leave my little boat upon it at night, while every spring tide the sea passed through the shingle under the house and welled up in a lane upon lower ground behind it. In spite of this, the house itself was perfectly dry, the basement being filled in with concrete 2 feet thick. My little boat was then the only one on the beach not owned by a professional boatman, and her first appearance there soon brought a group of the North End boatmen round her. I had rigged her up with a lug mainsail and a foresail. She was 2 feet 6 inches shorter than the smallest class of punts on the beach, and the first time I sailed in her, the men were surprised to find she was able to rather more than hold her own among them to windward. I found beach work at Deal, even in this small boat, comparatively easy after the heavier seas of Sidmouth. But when out in the strong tide rips of the Downs, I should have been glad of a larger boat. And in order to better face this kind of sea, I added to the dinghy's freeboard a 4.5-inch wash streak. This was done by a local boat builder who was curious to know where she was built, and when told said, "Well, I allowed she was built by a shipwright because everything is so strong about her." Some months afterwards, I found the same boat builder on the beach going carefully over my boat with his 2-foot rule, and he told me he was measuring her in order to give a price for one like her, to be built for an old sea captain who had met her off the South Sand Head lightship, turning to wind like a little horse. I soon established pleasant relations with the boatmen, and found plenty of handy bare-legged Deal urchins to help at a launch or haul up. From our windows we could see the Goodwins, and in gales of wind, through a glass, all that went on upon them, and among the shipping in the Downs, while in fine weather, after she was deepened, I was able to be off and out among the shipping in a few minutes, or to enjoy in her longer cruises to the South Sand Head one way and Ramsgate Harbour the other. Owing to the more permanent character of the beach and sheltered position of the Downs, the Deal men were able to establish upon it far better capstans and launching gear than was possible at Sidmouth, while their boats were all larger and more heavily ballasted than the little Sidmouth or the Beer Head luggers. The crews of all these larger luggers, or catboats and galley punts, had nothing to do with the work of hauling them up, which was left to gangs of old boatmen, employed by the boat owners at a fixed rate of 6 pence for each trip. On the other hand, the Deal boatmen often kept the sea for a week or more at a time, tending ships and pilots up the Thames to Gravesend or down Channel beyond Dungeness. I remember missing one of the largest luggers, the Tiger, for more than a fortnight, and was told she had remained nearly the whole time under Dungeness, fearing to run home through the heavy sea off the Admiralty Pier, Dover. While had it been a headwind, she would have been back at once. I saw one of these largest new luggers hauled up in halves, having split from end to end after a bump upon the sand in launching with an anchor and chain on board for a vessel in the Downs. A few days of strong southerly wind filled the Downs, and the ships then seen from our windows at night looked like the street lamps of a great city. And one of the strangest sights I ever saw was when a large Italian bark, in making a flare-up signal for assistance, took fire, from a bucket of paraffin capsizing on her quarter-deck, and breaking away from her anchors off Walmer, drove in flames through the whole fleet of ships to leeward of her, and burnt out upon the Goodwins near the Gull light vessel. Her crew were all saved by Deal boats. It was blowing almost a hurricane from southwest, and it was wonderful to watch the little black storm sails of the luggers and galley punts by the light of the fire and the moon as they flitted in and out among the crowded fleet of tossing shipping. There was a heavy sea rolling in all the time, and the wind being offshore, the crests of the waves were torn off in whirling clouds of spoondrift as the long lines of swell ran in on the beach. The force of the wind that night must have been great, for a window was blown in at the back of our house, and the glass carried 18 feet across the room, while the strength of 2 people was required to force open the door of the room. Yet these weatherly, open boats were at work through it all under canvas. The larger luggers, though without any true deck, are provided with a kind of movable cuddy, or large box, fitted in them between the main and fore thwarts, into which there is room for 4 men to creep in and sleep. The whole thing is perfectly watertight, with a small sliding door aft, and 2 little sliding windows forward. This gives the men a chance to keep some dry clothes and food on board when out cruising for more than a day. Though No. 5 Sandown Terrace was a substantial, well-built house, we soon discovered that all the rooms facing the Downs, with a nor'easter in winter, were almost untenable. But we had for next-door neighbours 2 old ladies who had lived in the terrace for years, and when we complained of this to them, they said, "Why, you've not pasted up your windows," and explained that from November to the end of March every chink of theirs facing the sea was hermetically closed by strips of cartridge paper carefully pasted over them. These old ladies wore short waists and turbans, and when the most able-bodied of them got under way for a morning cruise on the breezy esplanade, there was something about her as she rolled along under a big parasol which always reminded one of an 80-gun ship of the line of the Georgian era in full sail. They belonged also to that extinct, nerveless race of women who liked and encouraged barrel organ grinders, so that for an hour or so of every day of our stay at Deal, the rugged roar of the surf was mingled or softened by popular airs of the period. I was also much interested to find that, as natives of Margate, they knew J.W.M. Turner as a young man, when he used to visit friends of theirs there to see a young lady to whom he was then engaged to be married. The old ladies took no interest in Turner the artist, and spoke of him only as a poor, delicate youth, who was not expected to live long, and said that the young lady's relations wished the engagement broken off on that account. In a motherly way, these 2 elderly sea nymphs took an interest in my little boat and her crew, as indeed they did in all the boats and men who hailed from the north end of the beach. A tarred sea-walk extended from our house northward to the ruins of Sandown Castle, much of which then lay in huge masses of masonry, against which, in a gale, the sea broke furiously. It had lately been partially destroyed by gunpowder. Between this ruin and our terrace, the Van Kook lifeboat was housed, the gift of E.W. Cook, the marine painter. But I heard, a year or 2 after we left Deal, that owing to the rapid encroachment of the sea, this boat and house had to be removed further inland. Before living here, I had often read of people being blown down or carried off their legs by wind, but scarcely realized such stories until one evening I had to drop on all fours on this esplanade in order to keep myself from being blown off it into the surf on the beach. At such times, all the smaller boats, including my own, were lashed to a lamp or other post to keep them from being blown away, which reminds me that at Sidmouth I once saw a 16-foot boat, which had been lashed alongside a post, actually impaled upon it, with the post sticking through her bottom, the wind having turned her over on top of it. We remained 2 years at Deal, arriving there in August 1867 and leaving in August 1869 for Erith, where we took a commodious but jerry-built villa on high ground near Bexley Heath. My first plan for this move was to charter a Thames barge and load our things into her at Deal, but the uncertainty of the date of arrival and expense of transshipment at Erith decided me to trust them to Pickford and Company and the rail. We undertook this move, I think, with a vague notion that Erith was near London and the art world, but had not been there long before we found that practically this was not the case. Some persons may say here that we were wasting our substance on railways and riotous moving. I have come to the conclusion that this was not true in our case, and that an ordinary family trip for change of air costs more money and is not half so amusing or instructive as a household removal of even 100 miles by road or rail. While to those not too indolent to enjoy it, the packing and unpacking of furniture, pictures, and china, and their rearrangement in a fresh house, is a form of recreation, both mental and bodily, far exceeding those afforded by an ordinary seaside watering place. Our new villa, though on high ground, was not too far from the Thames for boating, and I had a mooring laid near the pier at Erith for my dinghy, which made the voyage from Deal of 80 miles in charge of an old boatman who asked 18 shillings for the job, or about 7 shillings less than she would have cost by rail. He left Deal in her about 7 the same evening that I did, and turned up at our new house the day after my arrival there, with the domestic cat who had been his companion in his arms. This little cat started carefully packed in a hamper, but the old man said he soon let her out of that after getting out to sea, and that puss at once made herself at home on board. I had not sailed on the Thames for nearly 20 years, and found it greatly changed, especially above Erith, Tripcott, and Galleon's Reaches, where both the air and water were far from sweet-smelling, while just before and after high water a long, close procession of screw steamers up and down the river made tacking across it under sail almost as risky as crossing the traffic of a crowded London street would be on a tricycle. This state of things did not, however, last long, and after tide time the river became comparatively clear of steamers, when, in company with my old red-sailed friends, the Thames and Rochester barges, there was plenty of room to tack across the river from Erith Brands and Purfleet up and down Longreach to Greenhithe, Gravesend, or through the Lower Hope into Sea Reach. I had the pleasure on one such trip of John Brett's company. The day proved almost calm. It was indeed a day of reflections, and I was amused as we drifted with the tide past Purfleet at a mental note he made aloud upon the effect of light and shade on the low ripples, of edge softening, edge gradation. That's the main thing about them. Owing to the enormous amount of varied human interest concentrated on its banks and afloat on its crowded stream, I have always felt that, aristocratically, the tidal waters of the Thames rank far above those of the upper river, which indeed would be a mere purling stream flowing past smooth-shaven lawns with no more human interest attached to it than a Hampshire trout stream, but for the locks and weirs by which it is canalized and connected by barge and flyboat with the world's great tidal highway. And I have been much interested of late years in the rediscovery, so to say, of this vast mine of artistic wealth by artists like Whistler and Wiley, while among writers nothing can be finer to my mind than Richard Jefferies' article, Venice in the East End. I have seen much of modern Venice myself, but never saw anything there to surpass the picturesque variety of colour and stately river bustle of the last of a flood, as one after another homeward-bound steamers and great clippers in tow of tugs come sweeping into Erith brands round Crayfordness, snugly sheltered under which, like a gipsy encampment by a roadside, unconcerned and heedless of all this flow of passing commerce, lies a fleet of little Thames Peterboats and shrimpers, all covered in forward with dark blanket tilts, with blue smoke curling from a black stovepipe poked through them. Then, by hugging the low, green Kentish foreshore with a leading wind, there were 5 miles of straight sailing down Longreach to Greenhithe and Fiddler's Reach, clear of steam traffic. But beyond the ever-changing variety and bustle of passing craft, it was tame sailing, even in a small boat after the Downs or the Solent. And except picking up a man who had capsized his canoe in a race one windy day, I met with no personal mishaps or adventures worth mentioning during the 2 years I remained at Erith. Before leaving Southampton, an old waterman there strongly advised me not to part with my new half-deck boat, because, said he, "You be sure to be back here again soon." I asked why he thought so, but, like a true prophet, he would or could give no reason for his opinion except that people always did come back. The old fellow was right, and after 2 years, when we left our commodious new villa at Erith for a substantial old red brick house in Moira Place, Southampton, I soon felt the want of a larger and faster boat than my dinghy. She made the voyage from Erith on the deck of a steamer, from which she was safely lowered into her old quarters at Southampton Docks. She, however, 4 years later, again returned to the Thames, after being sold to a Southampton boat builder, who resold her to a boating man at Chelsea, where, I was told by my friend Landseer Mackenzie, who took an interest in this little boat, she ended a long boat life of over 30 years in 1889 by getting crushed under a floating landing stage. When I built her in 1853, her material cost me £4, and I sold her for the same money 16 years afterwards. If she could only speak, every boat has a water-biography of her own. And I have gone rather fully into the life history of this little one as some encouragement to any amateur carpenter who may be inclined to take up that most fascinating of handicrafts, boat building. End of chapter 12.